The problem for the Russians is this. We have said that we will not relent, that we are going to fight them until they're destroyed. If you tell the Russians that, the Russians say to themselves, well, this war will only end when we are on the Polish border. That's a terrible situation, frankly, for Ukraine, because we've said we will not negotiate. I don't think Putin expected that this would drag on. I think he really thought that once he showed us in the West that he was serious and that the Russians would not tolerate this large anti-Russian military establishment in eastern Ukraine, that we would then say, stop, let's negotiate. And of course, he was wrong. His great fear was not just the Ukrainian force in eastern Ukraine, but that over time we would emplace missiles in eastern Ukraine that could reach Russia's nuclear deterrent. And that worried him about his ability then to deter us from using nuclear weapons against Russia in the future.
But how could this operation take so long?
Well, very simple. He had a relatively small regular army, and this small force was simply not large enough to fight a war in a country the size of Texas. Remember, he was initially only interested in a portion of what we would call Texas. It's as though you said, well, the Panhandle and eastern Texas are Russian. The rest of it's Ukrainian. I want to ensure the Russian citizens in the Panhandle and in eastern Texas have equal rights before the law. They're not oppressed. They're not being brutalized. They're not being punished for being Russians. That was his goal. And then to find some sort of solution for the two republics, Luhansk and Donetsk, and to extract from the Ukrainians the understanding that Crimea was not up for discussion. It was legitimately Russian and had been for hundreds of years. And he hoped then that he could make Ukraine neutral as a multinational, multicultural state, which is rather interesting because we have all of these people currently waging war against him who ostensibly here are insisting on multinationalism and multiculturalism, but they want to destroy Russia when Russia was only interested in ensuring equal rights for their own citizens and neutrality for Ukraine. We insisted, no, Ukraine has to be a member of NATO, and the Russian position had been for decades, no, that touches our borders, it sits on our border. We will accept neutrality. No one's forces there, not yours, not ours, no one's except Ukrainians. And they held up the Austrian State Treaty as a good model for Ukraine. And if you haven't looked at the Austrian State Treaty, you should, because it has worked very effectively. And he was convinced that this could work in Ukraine. Obviously, he was wrong, and that left him no choice but to do what he's done. There are estimates that the Ukrainians have now fielded 3 armies in a row. The first army was largely destroyed in the spring. Contrary to popular belief, the Ukrainians were not winning relentlessly, which was reported in the news media. The exchange rate with the Russians was never good. Then they built a second army in the summertime that was designed to take the offensive against the Russians. That army was largely destroyed by the fall. And then they built a third army, which is now dying. And much of it has died in Bakhmut, along this 160-mile front in the north of the Donbass, the Donetsk Basin. Bakhmut has become probably one of the largest bloodbaths we've seen, certainly since the Battle of Shanghai in 1937. Now there are estimates of 250,000 dead Ukrainians. That's beyond what I had anticipated. I thought perhaps 200,000. I'm being told no, it's much higher. And it's again because of this overwhelming strike presence on the Russian side. The Russians have the advantage in the air, they have the advantage on the ground. And the Ukrainians can't compensate for that because they simply don't have the wherewithal. Whatever we send to them is being destroyed almost as soon as it shows up at the front. I mean, they've been sending these HIMARS systems, rocket artillery systems over there. The drones that fly over identify them, the artillery strikes them, and they're dead. And this goes on and on and on.
I was just saying all this aid to Ukraine is that a debt to them?
Yeah, absolutely.
They'll be in debt for centuries. So.
Well, they already are, and there's no chance of ever climbing out of it. I mean, this is the great tragedy. Ukraine as a nation has been destroyed. They started out, we think, with maybe 37 million, 37.5. Remember, if you go back into the early 90s, they had almost 90 million people living in Ukraine. When this war started, there were about 37.5 million. there were already 2 million Ukrainians working and living in the West. In other words, everywhere from London to Rome. Now add to that 10 plus million refugees. At least 2 million Ukrainians that were Russians have gone into Russia. Another 9 million Ukrainians plus have gone into Western Europe. And each day more go there. There are almost no women and children left. You do have some men, but we're looking at somewhere between 18 and 22 million people left in Ukraine. And how many of those men are physically fit and capable of fighting? I don't know what that potential is, but it's way below what people estimated initially. And they're now bringing in women and young boys and men over 40, 50, 60 to come in and join units that have been reduced from, say, 500 men down to 100 men. I mean, this is a tragedy unlike anything we've seen since World War II unfolding in front of us. Well, if you look at the people that are running the show in Ukraine right now, they don't seem to be terribly concerned about the destruction of the Ukrainian nation and its state. That's the best that I can say. They're behaving very much like Stalin. And we now know that the losses during the Second World War were not 20 million. They were at least 35 to 39 million. In fact, when I was in Moscow in 2001, I was told that they were then had counted 39,900,000 and were still counting based on their access to the NKVD archives. This government seems to think in those terms, that they can sacrifice whole generations of men in order to achieve their aims. I don't see any evidence that it's going to work. And the Russians are not going to run out of ammunition. I mean, we've been hearing about the Russians running out of everything. Their factories, their manufacturing centers are turning out equipment and ammunition 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in multiple shifts. The Russians aren't running out of anything, but we are. We've just about run through our own war stocks. Same thing has happened in Europe, where the war stocks were never very high to begin with. So you've got the German defense minister saying we can't send anything else or we won't be able to defend ourselves. And I think you're going to hear that from a lot of European states now.
Is any of this helping Ukraine?
I don't think so. I think the only thing that we've done is played a key role in the destruction of Ukraine.